So the next section was to give you some basic definitions and also access to models for dissemination and implementation research. Some of you are more familiar with the basic definitions, others not so much. So bear with me, we are trying to link that gap between the novice, the intermediate, and the advanced learner. We are also going to provide you with some resources. From now on, again, we are moving in this mode of, overview, providing you with resources, and then hopefully in the follow-up sessions when we have panelists, you can ask some more applied questions from us. So first of all, Russ already mentioned this, dissemination and implementation science is relatively new in the context of health. There are other fields that did dissemination and implementation science under different terminologies. Health is fairly new. As a result of that, the terminologies are still evolving, and we have a lot of confusion in terms of mentioning certain terms and what they mean. This is just one example. This is actually from the Canadian colleagues, the KT, their knowledge translation language. They found 100 different terms describing knowledge translation. So you can imagine with the other related terms how many variations circulate. So perhaps the best advice I have ever heard from colleagues that at this stage of the field, still tell everyone what you mean by your term. If you are writing a paper, you are writing a proposal, it's good to define how you define that certain term in your certain case. But so I don't leave you completely vague. This is a very traditional definition of dissemination and implementation, and then dissemination and implementation research. I'm going to focus on the two terms of dissemination and implementation. Dissemination is the research active process through which information is being communicated to the target audience, and implementation is putting that evidence into place at the target setting. In a more simple way, if you think about, and these are just some examples, what we might do when we do dissemination, we might want to understand our target audience, package the evidence and the intervention in an appropriate way, and create and use appropriate channels that are very relevant to that particular target audience. And the research might measure the rate and speed of dissemination, identify who was and who wasn't reached, and compare different approaches, how successful they were at reaching the audience. Russ mentioned that dissemination and implementation are different terms, but there is an overlap. Implementation focuses more on the supporting of initial uptake of the implementation of the intervention, identifying and working with local champions, which was just discussed, and then also providing, for example, technical assistance during the process. During your research, you might look at and measure the level or degree of implementation. You might measure actually adaptations and fidelity. You compare different dissemination and implementation strategies, which we will talk about in our next panel. And then you might identify barriers, although the descriptive stage is now gone and you are mostly trying to find interventions that would act on those barriers. And we shouldn't forget the world, because here in the US we talk about implementation science or D&I research kind of interchangeably in some ways, but then there is also Canada and the UK and Europe and now Australia, and there are D&I conferences all over the world, and they use different terms, and many of them are actually more advanced than we are. So we should learn from them. That's another humbleness factor. The Canadian colleagues talk about knowledge for action terms, and so that's a completely different terminology. Knowledge translation is their go-to term for D&I or implementation science. And then you can see, as I mentioned, there are about 100 of those terms circulating in their literature. So if you search the literature, look for KT type of work as well. And then I'm limiting my kind of definitions here because you can read up on those, but an important one that you might hear often, and especially in the global health context, is scale up, expanding the coverage of successful interventions, and then scale out, which is perhaps the more recent term, and Greg is not here, but I wanted to acknowledge his recent publication on talking about scale out, which would be taking evidence-based interventions and adapt them either in a new setting or with new populations, especially in the context of healthcare delivery systems. And so there are two main types: one when the system is fixed and you change the population, and one where you are fixing the population and you are changing the system, you are moving into different settings. A big question, again, piggybacking on Russ's slide about quality improvement, implementation sciences, how they are different and similar. And so you might remember those overlapping elliptical kind of shapes there in his slide. Quality improvement and implementation science are sharing common goals around improving patient health outcomes, especially in the health services research arena. There are some differences in terms of the paradigms that they initially use, the methods, often the starting point, and the speed of action. Quality improvement is often happening from a local level, identifying a very specific issue to that setting and trying to solve that. Often it's smaller in scope, although it's not always true, especially in the VA. There are nationwide quality improvement initiatives. And then it's what is, I think, more exciting and important, it's iterative and rapid, which goes back to the pragmatic nature of it. Implementation science often starts with the evidence-based intervention, which, as Russ talked about, is controversial when we can call it evidence-based intervention. It is concerned with generalizability, which QI perhaps not initially. And there are perhaps more developed measures and larger scale. It is also much slower. And for that reason, often not feasible in the context of real world. So my proposal to everyone is to think about how we can learn from QI actually in implementation science. And there are some efforts of taking QI methodology, the PDSA cycles, blended learning evaluations, and actually one of our Ignite presentations will show you that, and use it in implementation science research. And then I think this is the right time for me to call your attention to the textbook on dissemination and implementation research in health. We have a copy here. Oh my goodness, the microphone. I have a copy here, so if you have not seen it before, feel free to have a look at it during the day. This is my only copy, so please leave it for me. There is a chapter in it on the terminology and terms on D&I, so you can look at some more terms, but more importantly, there are fantastic chapters, and all of the people who are here visiting are actually engaged in one or multiple chapters, so feel free to look at that today. In terms of models for D&I, this is going to be something that you will hear as soon as you start to think about writing a proposal for D&I. They want you to use D&I models. Many of you are already using D&I models or models in general in your work. Those who are not might be a little bit overwhelmed by the number of options. Theories, frameworks, and models obviously have different definitions in the more rigorous literature. I am using the term models to refer to both theories, frameworks, and more general models here. This is a slide that you can obviously not read. I would just want to focus your attention to the red words. Based on a review of funded D&I proposals at NIH, one of the characteristics of those proposals was that they used the conceptual framework and they actually carried it through. And when you look at the weaknesses of those that were not funded, one of the weaknesses was that they failed to articulate a framework or use it, operationalize it. So it is important if you want to get funded. There are other reasons why it's important. D&I models are helpful in terms of identifying what D&I strategies you should be using. They are helpful when you are interpreting your findings. They also can help you structure the development, management, and evaluation and intervention activities throughout the process, and they are meant to be used as such. There are a lot of proposals where they are mentioned, but they are not carried through. That is a problem when you are in a review panel, and I think many of my colleagues here who are more seasoned in reviewing grants will tell you that it is still very common that the model is mentioned at the beginning of the proposal, but then there is no sign of it later on, and that's a big problem at this stage. I also wanted to point you to some existing systematic reviews of D&I models. Here you can see 3 of them that are perhaps more prominent. 61 models were identified in the first article, perhaps the most important one by Rachel Tabak and colleagues. Another 25 practitioner-focused D&I measures in the Mitchell and colleagues article, and then 33 somewhat overlapping models from a UK perspective. So you can see there is a lot going on with models. More recently, a publication looked at implementation science theory use across an international sample, and they found that colleagues reported the use of up to 100 or more different D&I models. So you can tell that perhaps there is no need for more new D&I models. That's perhaps the most important message from my talk. And then to make it even more scary, when you are first starting to look at D&I models, this is just based on personal communication with colleagues from Canada. They are in the process of publishing a paper. They found 150 plus KT models. So try to look at the ones that exist. Don't try to invent your own. And then the question is, so which one should I use? And I'm not going to obviously go through all 150, but I'm going to highlight a few that our colleagues here use. I don't know if these are the best ones. These are the ones that we are familiar with, and you can add your own. One that I don't necessarily use, but it's one of the most comprehensive ones, and I know that talking with Greg a lot, I got infected by thinking of it. This was done by a colleague at UK, Trisha Greenhalgh. Her work is worth following. She did this actually for her dissertation work, identifying all the different factors that influence diffusion of innovations in service organizations. So if you want to be very comprehensive, her model might be one to look at. Moving to a little bit less complex, but still fairly complex one, is the CIFER framework, which will be one that you see very often if you work at the VA. It was developed by colleagues at the VA. Laura Demschroeder was involved with that as a lead author. And it still includes, now I am blanking, how many domains does it have or constructs? Who remembers? 5 domains, but then how many subconstructs? Do you remember that? It was 80 some. So it's still, when you get into the details of this outer setting, individuals involved, there are multiple subconstructs. So if you wanted to use this very comprehensively, I think that would not be feasible. You will want to use it as a guidance on identifying the important pieces for your work. There is great support to use CIFER, and some of my colleagues will actually be able to tell you more about it. There is actually this website where you can generate your own survey using kind of a click method of identifying which constructs you want to measure, and then it gives you actual interview questions or survey questions. So that's very neat and nice. The next one I'm going to highlight is the framework that Dr. Ahrens developed and uses with his colleagues, the Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment framework, or EPIS framework. If you work in the mental health context or even broader at this point, you will see EPIS cited very frequently. The uniqueness so far, I showed some other frameworks, is that it acknowledges the different phases when implementation happens. And then within each phase identifies critical constructs that you should consider. I know that there is a review under preparation of looking at how EPIS is being used, what kind of topics is being used, and also some guidance on how to use it better. So that will come out in the next few months. I'm looking at my colleagues here who are also working on that paper. But there are already wonderful publications and resources to use it, and I will show you actually an example. And then finally, I will mention a framework that I use most perhaps, and then Russ and I actually in our work. This is an expansion of the REAIM framework that Russ mentioned, the PRISM, Practical, Robust Implementation and Sustainability Model, or PRISM. And this was developed by Russ and Adrian Feldstein at KP Northwest, if I remember correctly, in the context of clinical healthcare improvement intervention, specifically colorectal cancer screening. We have used this now in other contexts, and it seems like a very nice and intuitive way of acknowledging context, multi-level nature of context, and then also incorporating the REAIM components, which are nice, intuitive outcomes. So I just wanted to mention that, of course, REAIM is always there if you don't have too much resources to use contextual measures as well, if you just want to focus on the outcomes. So these are just examples. As you can see, all of this could be okay for most of your projects. So when you make a decision, you might want to use some other types of guidance to select your model. Some of the features that I feel are characteristic of an optimal D&I model include acknowledgement of multi-level nature of D&I in some fashion, that it acknowledges that context matters. So if there is nothing about context, that becomes a little bit of a question whether it will work really well. It should be intuitive to you and your context and your research question. And it doesn't hurt if there are measures available. So you can actually link nicely the construct to actual measures. And finally, often we just go to the ones that our colleagues used, and that's okay. So if it has been used in your context, population, or for the health problem they use, that's not a bad guidance for this. I know that we have colleagues who are trying to develop more rigorous guidelines on how to choose D&I models. I don't have those yet. And then finally, a few requests and suggestions. No new models, please. I think everyone can find one that will work, or at least work close enough that you can adopt it. And very often you will need to adapt your model somewhat. And then please carry through your model throughout your proposals or papers. It doesn't only make it more fundable, but perhaps will also help you understand what you need to include, what you find, and help you organize your findings as well. And finally, I already mentioned some of the more complex frameworks, it's impossible to use all components, and that's also okay. You have to be able to justify why you focus on certain subcomponents, but you are okay saying that these are the constructs that matter in my current study. So that's fine. And then finally, this is just an example to guide you to a paper, and I didn't put in the reference here, I apologize, but the title will help you find it. This is the EPIS framework and how it's being operationalized fully in the JJ trials. This is a place where they show how the different constructs that they are using align with the strategies. And then the next one is, again, taking it to the next level. So you might want to have some sort of table or visual in your papers proposals showing how these different components of the framework are being used to identify your research questions, strategies, measures, and then communicate about your results. And the very last two slides. We have recently developed, past few years, this website that allows you to browse many of the frameworks. It has currently about 86 models included, D&I models, and we are in the process of adding some additional ones. This is publicly available, free, and you can actually go in and comment and rate the models, which is our next big move, so please do that. You can select them. You can also search by constructs. So if you need certain constructs to be included, you can choose those. And then in some cases, the constructs are linked to measures. That's perhaps the least well-developed area of the website. And when we have the discussion about measurement, you will understand why. It's still really hard to find measures, just a short note. So this is just one resource for you. And then finally, I'm so glad I put in this slide to refer you to our colleagues at WashU in St. Louis. Many of us work with them closely. They developed these wonderful toolkits for D&I, and this is just one example of the toolkit. What it talks about is how D&I gets relevant in various, I would say, T phases, development of interventions, efficacy trials, effectiveness research, and then the next phase. And in each phase, they provide you with some guidance whether D&I could be used. And basically, what we just talked about, D&I can be used in early phases as well, using this designing for dissemination and implementation angle. But visit this website, and these are also freely available tools. I think I provided reference there. Good, I did.